is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The curtain has just fallen on the 73rd United Nations General Assembly. As world leaders tried to tackle some of the most pressing issues of our time, the debate on the future of multilateralism took center stage. With US President Donald Trump rejecting globalization on the one hand and the developing world defending it on the other, the future of multilateral engagement now hangs in the balance. So are we witnessing the formation of a new world order? And can the United Nations maintain its relevance in a changing world? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Before we start our conversation, let's take a listen to some of the keynote speeches from the general debate at the just concluded 73rd UN General Assembly in New York.
As our Secretary General Kofi Annan once reminded us, we share, I'm quoting, a common destiny. We can master it only if we face it together. And that, my friends, is why we have the United Nations. End of quote. Our future rests on solidarity. We must repair broken trust. We must reinvigorate our multilateral project. And we must uphold dignity for one and for all.
It is the duty of France, as well as all of its European partners, including the EU, to be in the front lines of this combat to build a new world order with a human face that knows no protectionism, isolationism, but is entirely realistic. In the 21st century, we shall only triumph through bolstered multilateralism, one that is genuinely in a position to resolve pressing issues, but also one which allows us to actually address the root causes.
The current two-track system of global governance is unsustainable. A few get to be the ones to define the norms by which others shall be judged. But standards that do not apply to everyone equally are not universal.
In the face of new developments and severe challenges, China will keep to its commitment and remain a champion of multilateralism. Standing at this podium back in 2015, Chinese President Xi Jinping, in his statement reflecting the keen understanding of mankind's common interest and the future of our planet, called for the building of a community with a shared future for mankind. This initiative is in keeping with the trend of history and echoes the call of the times. It adds to our conviction and strength as we pursue common endeavors to protect this global village.
Now, joining me to analyze the state of multilateralism in a changing world, as well as some outcomes from the UN Assembly, I'm joined by Michael Johns from Philadelphia. He's a co-founder of the National Tea Party movement. In Beijing is Professor Xu Xinduo. He's a senior fellow at Panghua Institution and co-author of The Rise of China and the Real Western World. From Brussels, we are joined by Gert Lepoort. He's the Deputy Director of the European Center for Development Policy Management. And with me in studio in Nairobi is Ambassador Erastus Mwencha. He's a former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining in this discussion. Let's start off with you, Gert Lepoort, in Brussels, because the UN is under siege, globalization is under attack, the future of multilateralism is hanging in the balance. In the words of UN Secretary General, we share a common destiny. From where you're sitting, Gert Lepoort, though, against these developments that we are seeing, do we still share a common destiny?
Well, I think we still share a common destiny, but it is true that we are far away from the ambitions that we expressed in 2015, when we had this big ambition to have a number of global goals. And I remember that only 3 years back, there was a lot of enthusiasm at global level to achieve these sustainable development goals by 2030. In the past years, we have seen that we have really moved a long way backwards from these ambitions of 2015. We did not only witness the phenomenon of Donald Trump, but also in the European Union we have seen a lot of pressures on globalization and multilateralism. particularly with Brexit, with the migration crisis, rising populism in a number of European member states.
Right.
So this is the context in which we are working at this very moment.
Professor Xu, in Beijing, do we still share a common destiny? In the words of Gert Laporte there, though we are witnessing a lot of pressures on globalization and multilateralism.
Yeah, definitely. I do see there's a common destiny for humankind, whether you are in Brussels, Washington, Beijing or Nairobi. For example, in terms of the fight against the climate change, which actually affects every individual on this globe and our future generations. So that requires joint efforts from every individual member countries to fight against that trend. So that shows like there is indeed a common destiny, and we should work together under the practice of multilateralism. And the unilateralism will only go so far and will damage the spirit of every nation of working together and the leadership of the UN.
Before I come to you, though, Michael Jones in Philadelphia, in his second speech to the United Nations, President Trump slammed globalization. Let's take a listen to part of what he said there.
We will never surrender America's sovereignty to an unelected, unaccountable global bureaucracy. America is governed by Americans. We reject the ideology of globalism, and we embrace the doctrine of patriotism.
Michael Jones, though, in the words of Donald Trump, though, isn't this putting the notion of a shared common destiny there in jeopardy now?
I think the president has it right, and I think it was important that the General Assembly hear those words. Ultimately, the future of individual countries and individuals within those countries rests on the elected governments of those countries and the direction that individuals within them take. The president's correct. No one elected the United Nations. The United Nations is not directly accountable to citizens of the world. In many respects, it has failed. While it's had some great accomplishments, it's fallen short in a great number of ways. On the other hand, I will say this: the United States is the foundation on which the UN was created in 1945. It's the foundation on which the UN has been built. The U.S. is far and away the largest financial contributor to the UN, and I think the UN does have relevance in the 21st century if it can hone in its goals and work in a way that actually does address the commonality of national interests around the world, such as human rights, such as peacekeeping, such as humanitarian relief. These are things the UN could do well. But there are other things I think it's attempting to do that stretch beyond the bounds of a multinational institution.
Right. Ambassador Mwencha, I want to get your thoughts here. You've heard the sentiments from China, from the European Union here, and also from the United States. Where does Africa see itself fitting in this changing dynamic, and what are Africa's thoughts?
Africa has always believed in multilateralism, but of course we know that all is not well. In fact, the UN reform itself, Africa has been saying, the UN does not work at its best because if you look at, for instance, the UN Security Council, Africa doesn't have a seat, but Africa has not left because we are outside. Africa has said, let's reform. And there are a number of global challenges like climate change, the shared goals. The answer is not to retreat to nationalism. The answer is global challenges can only be dealt within the framework of global setting. So I am not sure that, Michael, I understand what it really means about patriotism and being in a global setting.
Let's put that to Michael Jones here, because the U.S. has benefited essentially from globalization, and it is a nation or built as a nation of migrants. Are these views of Donald Trump, are they unifying or dividing the world? And as Erastus Mwencha here points out, what does it mean to be patriotic in this setup?
Well, I think it's to put your individual country's interest and your loyalty to that country at the pinnacle of priorities. And if you are a citizen of Africa or a citizen of China or a citizen of any country in the EU, and you're looking to the United Nations, not your own government, to solve your problems, you are approaching it in incorrect ways. There are contributions that the UN has made and can make to the development of countries around the world and to the containment of disasters. But there are also inherent limitations. And I think one of the great mistakes, and this is something I think President Trump was right in warning about, is that if you are looking to the United Nations to say establish democratically elected and accountable governments, or to protect human rights in your country, or to develop your country, it may be able to contribute around the margins in constructive ways to those goals, but that is not the institution that's going to do that. It is up to the citizens of those countries to do that. That has been the story of the history of the world, and it certainly has been the story of the United Nations now for over 7 decades.
Right. Professor Hsu, your thoughts on that, though, and do you find Trump's sentiments, though, unifying or now dividing the world? Your reaction to Michael Jones' sentiments?
Well, look, if you look at the policy choice for President Trump, for example, the withdrawal from Paris Accord in the climate fight, the fight against climate change, and also the withdrawal from the Iranian deal, this is actually making the situation worse. So in terms of globalism and patriotism, this is not a thing, not a choice between A and B. It's a harmony of A and B. In terms of government development, country development, of course, you look to your government about individual efforts and to make your country a better place. But at the same time, when individual countries are together, there are certain rules to regulate the behavior of every country, so we can coexist peacefully in a stable world order.
Right. Gert Laporte, let me come back to you, though, because you mentioned about the forces that are governing Europe at the moment. We are seeing Britain withdrawing from the European Union there. We are seeing a lot of nationalism sentiment taking root, in some European countries. Would you say anti-globalization sentiment now is growing in Europe?
There is definitely a lot of anti-globalization sentiment, but I would also underline the positive elements that I retain from this current ongoing debate. For example, the example of Brexit has not been followed by other European member states. I think many member states are aware that the UK is in a real mess by leaving the European Union. And even the most skeptical European member states, they never have asked to leave the European Union. So they see an interest in staying in the Union. They also see an interest in staying in the Eurozone. So this is a clear sign that it is not all that pessimistic. But let me go back to what was said by the other speakers. I think there is nothing wrong with self-interest, but what we need is a kind of, indeed, rules-based world global community. So we need to respect a number of rules where everyone is able and free to defend its own interests. That's normal. That's very normal. But as long as you don't have global institutions to solve global problems, you will have major difficulties. And what we see in the US, but also in Europe and in various other parts of the world, is that many individuals, many citizens have lost trust in globalization. Why? Because they are not amongst the winners of that globalization process. They are really at the losing end. And I think one of the major challenges now for the international community is to make sure that globalization becomes an inclusive process and that we reform our institutions, including the UN institutions, to become more representative bodies where people really entrust a certain degree of responsibility to.
Right. Michael Jones, your thoughts on that? Is the United States adopting a rather defeatist situation here?
By the way, I don't think the position of the United States is against globalism or for globalism. I think we're simply acknowledging the inherent limitations of that. And I think the contradiction in what's been said so far by my colleagues is the fact that you're discussing countries and individuals who've been left behind by globalization. Well, why is that? Predominantly, it's because what is a body like the UN ultimately? It's a body that's represented by ambassadors of countries that send those ambassadors to New York ostensibly to represent whose interests exactly? Usually it's their country's interests. And you inherently in that design have, with much of the country, much of the world, a large percentage of countries that are not democratically elected. This is one of the reasons the United States, I think, ultimately withdrew from the United Nations Human Rights Council. We had countries like Venezuela and Cuba, some of the worst human rights violators in the world, sitting in judgment on human rights conditions in countries that had vastly superior human rights conditions. In fact, seeing the politicization of that body, where I think you had roughly 47% of its human rights condemnations devoted to one country, Israel. Nothing on Russia. Nothing on Cuba. Nothing on Venezuela. Nothing on Iran. Why is that? Why is that? We have to ask that question. Why is it? And I think why is it that that's occurring? The answer is that there's an inherent limitation to what you can do in a multinational institution.
Let me get your thoughts on that, Ambassador Mwanja. I see you shaking your head.
Okay. We all know that if we don't have a rule-based global trade, and that is a question you have not answered to me up to now. Are you saying we should all now set up our own rules, that we can trade our own rules? And if we go that route, of course we know that those who are, big will bulldoze their way and negotiate bilateral trade agreements, like what we are seeing some of the countries are doing, including United States. But that is, again, a defeatist. Are we going to have 1 million of trade agreements, each country negotiating on its own, or we sit under the WTO, see what is not working? If it is not working, go to the rules. The answer is not to walk away, it's not to kill it.
Right, and on that note, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue the conversation on the United Nations in a changing world. Stay tuned.
China Global Television Network. From broadcast centers in Beijing, Washington and Nairobi. A unique global perspective. 6 channels and a video content service. News when you want it and where you want it. On TV screens, websites, mobile platforms and social media. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to Talk Africa. Let's continue our analysis of the just concluded UN summit and its relevance in a changing world. There's been a lot of support for multilateralism, particularly from the global south. So how do other countries, though, plan to defend multilateralism beyond just words?
I think what we need at this moment is a rational debate on how to restructure our global institutions. And if you look at the Security Council, for example, at this moment, this is a Security Council that was composed in 1946. The world has so much changed that it does not reflect any longer the power relations in this world. And whether we like it or not, also in Europe and in the West, I think we should find new UN or global institutions that reflect better the changing power relations. So there should be space created for countries like India, Brazil, certain African countries, or maybe regions. Maybe we should regroup our global institutions with regional groupings, representative regional groupings. Why should Europe be represented by individual member states? Maybe they should be represented by the European Union. The same with Africa. I hear that South Africa, that Nigeria would have an ambition to be part of a Security Council.
Right.
But wouldn't it be better that African states entrust that responsibility to the African Union, which they don't do at this moment? They don't trust their own institutions. So we need to move towards more effective representative types of bodies.
In the words of President Paul Kagame, though, in terms of speaking with one voice, he said at the African Union that Africa has too often stood out for division and dysfunction in practice. We have ceded responsibility for our future to others, not by force, but by default. But what exactly then is Africa doing now to claim back responsibility for its own actions?
Well, one of the things that Africa now is focusing on is establishment of a continental free trade area. That is like the process that Europe took you don't put the cart before the horse. Political integration, because on matters of, say, global governance, global policy, global diplomacy, that is a deeper integration because it requires coordination of national positions. Trade is much easier. So let's start with that. And I think the moment you establish, for instance, a customs union, you naturally will have to have one person coordinating that policy like Europe does. If you go to Europe, trade is under Brussels. And once we also start integrating our economies, it will be easy for us to start talking about having a common or a single policy, foreign policy.
Right. Gert Laporte, I do want to come to you here. The U.S. is withdrawing from some multilateral organizations here. Do you think the U.S. action, though, will lead to a vacuum?
Well, I think there is definitely a group of countries that are following the line of Trump and of the US. There is a need to reform the current system. Let's be honest about this. I think the UN institutions also duplicate each other. There's too many institutions. They are too costly. The demands are always increasing on the UN system, and you see that the means are not growing in the same way. So there is a need there to rationalize the institutions and to really save what is really needed and where the UN can really make a difference. And I think it is needed to continue that type of reflection, because the conflicts in the world that are unresolved are growing. We don't find answers to the Syria crisis, for example. We don't find answers to the Yemen crisis. We need to find the right mechanisms in our global society to deal with these particular issues. And if you say patriotism or going our own way is the way we should pursue, then I think that the world will get into deep, deep trouble, not only in terms of security, in terms of wars and conflicts, but also in terms of climate change and a whole range of other global issues.
Right. Professor Siu, State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, though, said that China will remain a champion of multilateralism. So if there is a vacuum, though, is China ready to step in to fill the void? And if there is no vacuum, what will be China's strategy in dealing with the rest of the world?
Well, for China, of course, if you look at the past 40 years of reform and opening up, that's a process of China's integration of the international system, being a member of WTO and being a more and more important member to the UN. And I think, like, if you look at China, China is a member of, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. At the same time, China established or, led the efforts to establish like Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. Things like that China is doing is actually an addition or a plus to the international institutions. I think what China is doing is trying to do or to reinforce the public institutions or international institutions, in particular United Nations, while at the same time pursuing necessary reforms, for example, like the UN reforms over there.
Michael Jones?
This is not an all or nothing debate. You can accept that there is value in some components of multilateralism. There's a need for certain components of multilateralism, while also acknowledging that in some respects bilateralism, agreements between countries, have value, and also acknowledging that we're a world comprised of very different governments and very different ideologies and very different approaches. It's very difficult to impose one standard on the world and not suffocate the rights of self-determination of those citizens. So we can accept multilateralism has its value, it has its role, but it also has its limitations.
Right, gentlemen, we are winding up in a moment, but I want to get a final comment from all of you, though. Are we seeing the emergence of a new world order, and what is the future of the United Nations? Gert Laporte first.
Well, I think indeed that there is a need to reform the United Nations system. Because otherwise the United Nations system will get into deep trouble. They lack already resources, and if a few countries will also drop out of some of the UN agencies, there might be even more problems. So we should look at the different UN agencies and institutions, see to what extent they duplicate each other, see to what extent we can rationalize the various organizations. And then, of course, we need to have this major reform of the Security Council, because we need global institutions to solve global problems, and particularly problems related to conflict which in the world are not at this moment being resolved through the existing systems. And we cannot go on with another 5 or 10 years of Syria war and so many other conflicts at global level. I think we need to have global institutions that operate well and that are representative and that also gain the trust of the global population.
Michael Jones, are we seeing the emergence of a new order? And how does the United States see the future of globalization, multilateralism, and a new order?
The United States is one of the largest providers of foreign aid in the world, the largest actually. We're one of the largest trading partners in the world. We're one of the largest contributors, the largest contributor to many of these multinational organizations, including the UN that we're discussing. So clearly, the U.S. is right at the epicenter of multilateralism and multinationalism. I think the issue of the 21st century, though, is to understand the limitations and constraints of that. Ultimately, we have enough history now to see what does and does not work for economic development, for political democratization, and for well-being of mankind. And I think there's limitations to what a multinational institution can do to resolve some of those issues.
Professor Hsu, your thoughts on that? Are we seeing a new world order, and what role will China be playing?
Well, I think obviously changes are taking place, especially with the rise of nationalism, populism in Western nations, rich nations, like in particular in the United States. You are seeing, so these efforts are undermining the global institutions, including the United Nations. So during such a time of change, I think developing nations like China, India, African countries, Latin American countries, based on their similar historical experience, that they should be united because they are weak economically, they are weak politically. Only by being united, they can speak louder and have their voice heard. This is also South-South cooperation. Right,
Ambassador Mwenche, you have the final word.
Yes, there is a new world order that is emerging. And one of the aspects that I see coming is a possibility of a post-United States world arrangement, because US would have walked away and left an empty seat, and nature knows no vacuum. But I also want to agree with what Mike has said, that there are limitations of the current multilateralism. The answer, because we live in a shared world, we have a common destiny. What we need is reform, and that reform, it cannot be the same way that the UN that was set up in 1945-46 with the victors of the Second World War who sat down and wrote rules. The world has moved on, has changed. And so let's sit down and do it. UN has served us well because we have had 70 years of peace. And that is the role that we can assign to UN. But the answer is not to walk away, because if we kill UN today as it is, we'll have to re-establish tomorrow.
Right, gentlemen, very interesting discussion here, but that's all we have time for. We'll leave it there on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our panel of experts. In Beijing, Professor Hsu Xin-Duo, he's a senior fellow at Panghua Institution and co-author of The Rise of China and the Real Western World. From Philadelphia, Michael Jones, the co-founder of the National Tea Party Movement. And from Brussels, Gert Laporte, Deputy Director of the European Center for Development Policy Management. And in Nairobi, Ambassador Erastus Mwenche, former Deputy Chairperson of the African Union Commission. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. And do join us again next week for more on Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi. Until next time, goodbye.